Emma Parker sat in seat 7A of the airplane, her small backpack tucked neatly under the seat in front of her. To anyone watching, she looked like an ordinary teenager traveling alone. She wore a simple hoodie, her long brown hair pulled back into a loose ponytail and a pair of headphones resting lightly around her neck. Her eyes, however, told a different story. They were quiet, distant, as if carrying secrets she couldn't put into words. Around her, the cabin buzzed with the gentle rhythm of travel. Families whispered to each other, businessmen tapped on laptops, and children flipped through picture books. The hum of the engines filled the space with a steady lull, almost like a giant heartbeat guiding everyone through the skies. Emma pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. Clouds drifted lazily beneath them, white pillows stretching into infinity. Somewhere far below, cities lived and breathed, but up here everything felt silent and separate. She liked that feeling. It made her feel invisible. But Emma was not invisible, not really. She was carrying a story, one she hadn't told anyone on this flight. Emma's mother had hugged her tightly at the airport earlier that morning. "Call me the moment you land," she'd said, kissing her forehead. "And remember, you're stronger than you think." Those words echoed in Emma's head now. Her mother always said them, but this time they had landed differently. Heavier somehow. Maybe because Emma knew she was traveling not just to visit family, but to face pieces of her past. Her father had been a pilot, a decorated one, though Emma had been too young to understand what that meant when he was alive. She remembered fragments, his leather flight jacket hanging on a hook, his deep laugh when he lifted her high into the air, the smell of jet fuel lingering on his clothes when he came home from base. He used to call her his little sparrow. She didn't fully understand why, but she remembered how the name made her smile. "Sparrow always finds her way," he would say, tapping her nose gently. Now, years later, Emma carried that name deep in her heart. It wasn't on her passport, it wasn't on her boarding pass, but it was part of her in ways no one around her could guess. The number 7A didn't mean much to the other passengers. It was just a window seat tucked near the wing. But to Emma it felt strangely significant. She remembered once, long ago, sitting in her father's old squadron building as he and his fellow pilots laughed and swapped stories. She had been only 6 or 7, swinging her legs on a chair too big for her. When she heard them mention Lucky 7, she never forgot it. Now, as she sat in 7A, she traced her fingers over the armrest and whispered to herself, "Maybe I'm still lucky." The woman sitting beside her, a kind stranger with a book in her lap, glanced at her and smiled. But Emma quickly looked back out the window. She didn't want conversation. She wanted silence and maybe answers, even if she didn't know the questions yet. The plane climbed higher, cutting through a patch of thin clouds. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting the cabin with a golden glow. A toddler giggled somewhere in the back. A flight attendant wheeled a cart down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. Life felt ordinary, steady. But Emma's thoughts were far from ordinary. Every time she looked at the clouds, she imagined her father's jet slicing through them, strong and fast. She had vague memories of standing at a runway fence, her small hands gripping the wire as she watched planes roar into the sky. She used to scream and wave, convinced her father could see her even from the cockpit. Now, watching the endless blue stretch before her, she whispered inside her mind, "Are you still up there, Dad? Do you still see me?" Her chest ached with both longing and pride. Emma wasn't used to traveling alone. She was only 16, and though she tried to look calm, her nerves rattled with every small sound. She checked her boarding pass twice, then checked again, even though she knew exactly where she was sitting. She kept her backpack close, her fingers brushing the zipper every few minutes as if to reassure herself it was still there. Inside the backpack was a photograph. It was her father in uniform holding her as a toddler. She had folded and unfolded that photo so many times the edges had grown soft, nearly torn. She carried it everywhere like a secret compass. The passengers around her barely noticed her. To them, she was just a quiet kid in 7A. But Emma knew she carried more than her seat number. She carried the shadow of someone who had once soared among the clouds, someone who had given her a name that meant flight, freedom, and homecoming. The flight stretched on, hours slipping by. Emma dozed lightly, waking to the rattle of a cart or the shift of turbulence. Each time she would blink, press her cheek against the window and stare at the sky outside. It was quiet. Almost too quiet. Something inside her stirred, a strange restlessness she couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a sense of waiting, like the pause before music begins. She thought of the stories her mother had told her about her father's missions. He had flown through storms, through nights, through danger, and he had always kept his calm. Emma wondered if she had inherited that calm. She wondered if deep inside her she carried more of him than she realized. As the flight attendants dimmed the lights for passengers to rest, Emma sat awake, her face turned toward the window. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. A girl with tired eyes but a quiet strength she didn't yet recognize. She thought about the word sparrow. To others it was just a bird, small and unimportant, but to her father it had meant something greater. It meant survival. It meant finding your way home no matter how far you flew. Emma touched the photograph in her backpack again and breathed deeply. Somewhere inside she felt that her journey was only beginning. She didn't know how or why, but she sensed the sky had more to say to her. And soon it would. Because outside the clouds, unseen by the passengers, a distant sound was beginning to rise. Not yet close, not yet clear, but coming. The kind of sound only a sparrow's daughter would truly understand. The airplane drifted smoothly through the upper sky, leaving behind the patchwork of land and sea far below. Inside the cabin, passengers were calm, some napping, others lost in movies or books. The low hum of the engines had become a steady background song, lulling everyone into a sense of routine. But Emma Parker, sitting in seat 7A, could not relax. Her mind was alive with restless thoughts. She traced shapes on the window with her fingertip, following the outline of the wing outside. Every now and then she adjusted her headphones, though no music was playing. She was listening instead to the silence between the sounds of the aircraft, as though expecting something to break it. Her heart told her the quiet would not last. The roar that changed the cabin, it began softly, almost hidden beneath the drone of the engines. A low rumble, steady but growing. At first Emma thought it was only turbulence, the sound of air currents pressing against the fuselage. But the noise sharpened, splitting into a roar unlike anything a passenger jet could make. The cabin shuddered faintly. A few passengers stirred awake, blinking in confusion. The woman seated next to Emma lowered her book, frowning toward the window. Emma leaned forward, pressing her face against the glass. Then she saw them. Two shapes cutting through the clouds, sleek and powerful, moving with a grace that no commercial plane could match. Their sharp silhouettes gleamed in the sunlight. Fighter jets close enough that Emma could see the shimmer of heat trailing from their engines. Her pulse quickened. She knew exactly what they were, F-22 Raptors. Around the cabin, whispers rose. People craned their necks toward the windows, alarmed but fascinated. Children pointed and gasped. A man across the aisle muttered, "What in the world?" The airplane captain's voice came over the intercom, strained but calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. It seems we've been joined by an escort. We are maintaining course and everything is under control. Please remain seated." But his tone suggested even he didn't quite understand what was happening. Emma's chest tightened. She felt both fear and recognition, as if the sky itself had been waiting for her. The overhead speakers crackled with static. At first, the passengers thought it was just interference from the jets outside. But then a voice cut through, deep and steady, echoing with command. "Seat 7A, call sign Sparrow."
"Do you copy?"
The words hung in the air like lightning after thunder. The cabin froze. People looked at each other, startled, confused. Some whispered, "Seat 7A?" and began glancing up and down the aisle to see who was sitting there. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her stomach flipped, and she sank into her seat, her fingers gripping the armrest. They had said it. They had called her by the name only her father had used, the name from years ago. The voice came again, firmer this time. "Sparrow, this is Eagle 1. Do you copy?" Emma's hands trembled. She could hear her own heartbeat louder than the engines. The woman beside her stared, whispering in disbelief. "They're calling you." But how would they? Emma didn't answer. Her lips parted, but no words came. How could she explain that a squadron of fighter pilots somehow remembered a child's nickname from long ago? Memories of the hangar her mind flashed back to one of the few clear memories of her father. She was 6 years old, running through the wide hangar where jets rested like sleeping giants. Her father and his fellow pilots had been laughing, calling each other by strange names, Eagle, Falcon, Hawk. One of them bent down to her level, smiling, and said, And this one? This little bird needs a call sign too. Her father had grinned and answered without hesitation. She's Sparrow. The hangar had erupted with laughter and agreement. From that day forward, whenever she visited the base, the men called her Sparrow. She had thought it was just a silly joke. A child's game. Now, years later, hearing the word echo from the sky itself, she realized it had been more than a game. They had remembered. Passengers began murmuring louder now, their eyes darting between the window and Emma. A man 2 rows back whispered, "She's in 7A." A flight attendant, pale but composed, walked quickly down the aisle. She stopped beside Emma, kneeling so her voice wouldn't carry far. "Honey, do you know why they're saying that?" Emma's lips quivered. She wanted to deny it, to say no, but the truth pressed heavy on her chest. Slowly she nodded. The attendant blinked in surprise. "Then what should we do?" Emma swallowed hard. Tell them. Tell them Sparrow is here." Her voice was quiet, but it carried a strength she didn't know she had. Inside, Emma was shaking. She didn't know what the Jets wanted or why they had come now on this flight. She was just a girl with a backpack and a folded photo. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't her father, but maybe in some way she was still Sparrow. Her mind spun with questions. Did her father's squadron send them? Was it some sort of recognition? Or was there something bigger happening, something she couldn't see? She pressed her forehead against the glass again, staring at the F-22 flying alongside them. The pilot's helmet glinted in the sun, faceless and distant. Yet she felt him watching her. She wondered if he had once known her father. Confirmation, the intercom hissed again. "Sparrow, confirm identity." "Repeat. Sparrow, confirm identity." The attendant looked at Emma expectantly. The passengers stared wide-eyed. Emma's cheeks burned under the weight of their attention. She drew in a shaky breath, then whispered again, louder this time. "Sparrow copies." The cabin fell silent. The fighter jet outside tilted its wing in response, a precise, graceful movement. To Emma, it felt like a bow of respect. Whispers rippled through the cabin, but Emma barely heard them. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just Emma Parker, the quiet girl with headphones. She was Sparrow, and the sky knew her name. As the jets held their formation, Emma's thoughts returned to her father. She remembered his voice saying, "Every bird has a call sign in the air. Yours is Sparrow because you'll always find your way home." Tears blurred her vision. She blinked them away, not wanting the passengers to see her cry. But in her heart she felt him close, closer than he had been in years. Maybe the world had forgotten his name. Maybe time had moved on. But these pilots hadn't forgotten, and through them, his memory still lived. Emma closed her eyes for a moment and whispered to herself, "I'm still Sparrow, Dad, I hear you." And though she didn't know what would come next, she felt a new strength rise quietly inside her. The plane flew on, steady and unshaken, but everything inside the cabin had changed. People no longer looked at Emma as just a teenager in seat 7A. They looked at her with awe, confusion, even respect. Emma sat taller, her fear still present, but softened by something stronger. The voice from the jets had awakened a part of her she hadn't realized was waiting. The journey was no longer just about reaching her destination. Something greater was unfolding, and she was in the center of it. Outside the window, the F-22s remained close, guardians in the endless blue. And inside her, Emma Parker, Sparrow, waited for whatever message the sky still had to give her. The silence inside the airplane was unlike anything the passengers had ever felt. The steady hum of the engines continued, but it was swallowed by the weight of what had just happened. Everyone in the cabin had heard the strange voice over the intercom. Everyone had heard the call sign, Sparrow. And everyone had realized it was meant for the quiet girl in seat 7A. Emma Parker sat frozen, her heart racing so fast she thought the people around her might hear it. She had spoken, just 2 small words, Sparrow copies. The moment they left her lips, something shifted. The passengers no longer looked at her as just another kid. They watched her as though she was connected to something far larger, something they couldn't understand. Emma's hands shook, but she held them together tightly in her lap. She wanted to disappear into the seat, but at the same time she felt a strange pull, like a door had been opened. One she had no choice but to step through. Whispers in the cabin, the whispers spread quickly. Why are they talking to her? Who is Sparrow? Is she some kind of military kid? Emma heard them but didn't turn her head. She stared straight out the window at the fighter jet flying close beside them. Its sleek body glistened in the sunlight, powerful and silent like a guardian made of steel. The woman sitting next to her leaned slightly closer. Her voice was soft, careful. "Sweetheart, what's happening? Do you know those people?" Emma's throat tightened. She wanted to answer, but how could she explain? How could she put into words that her father's world, something she thought belonged only to the past, was suddenly alive again in the sky beside her? So instead of explaining, she whispered, "I think they knew my dad." The woman blinked, her face full of questions, but she didn't push further. She simply nodded, as if understanding that whatever this was, it mattered deeply. Emma pressed her palm lightly against the window. She thought of her father again, of the times he had scooped her up in his arms and spun her around while calling her his little sparrow. Back then, she had thought it was just a sweet name, nothing important. But now, hearing it from the sky itself, she realized it had been something more. Her father had given her more than a nickname. He had given her a piece of himself, a way to belong to his world. Her mind filled with memories, the sound of his boots on the kitchen floor, the faded patches on his jacket, the way he pointed at the horizon and said, "The sky remembers even if people forget." She closed her eyes, letting the words echo. Maybe the sky really did remember. The radio crackled again, snapping everyone back to attention. The deep voice returned, calm but firm. "Sparrow, this is Eagle One, we acknowledge. Stand by for further message." The passengers looked around nervously. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A little boy whispered loudly, "Mom, is she a spy?" The mother hushed him quickly, embarrassed. Emma's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. She didn't feel like a spy. She didn't feel like a hero either. She felt like a girl who had boarded a plane expecting a quiet trip, and instead found herself caught between the past and the present. Still, hearing that voice stirred something deep inside her. She didn't understand why they had reached out to her, but a part of her wanted to listen. Questions without answers. The flight attendant returned, kneeling beside her again. "Emma, are you all right?" she asked gently. Emma nodded, though her eyes were still wide with fear. "Do you know what they want?" the attendant pressed. Emma shook her head. "No, but Sparrow was my dad's name for me. His friends at the base used to call me that too." The attendant blinked in surprise. "So they really do know you?" Emma looked back out the window at the jet. "I guess so." The attendant hesitated, then placed a comforting hand on her arm. "Well, whatever this is, you're safe here. You're not alone." Emma managed a small smile, grateful for the kindness. But in her heart, she knew this was something only she could face. The F-22 tilted slightly, its nose angled as if acknowledging her presence. Emma imagined the pilot inside, faceless behind the helmet, yet somehow aware of her every movement. She wondered if he had flown with her father, if he remembered the little girl who used to run through the hangars with goggles too big for her face. Did he remember when they had all laughed and called her Sparrow? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Outside, the second fighter jet held position just behind the wing. Together, they looked like guardians flanking the plane, their presence both intimidating and strangely comforting. Emma whispered softly, "Why now? Why today?" The call sign no longer felt like a simple word. It felt heavy, filled with meaning she didn't yet understand. Sparrow wasn't just a nickname anymore. It was a bridge between her and her father, between her past and the strange present unfolding before her. And now, the whole plane knew it too. Emma could feel the eyes of the passengers on her. She kept her gaze fixed on the clouds, pretending not to notice, but inside she felt exposed. Her private connection to her father had been pulled into the open, shared with strangers. But maybe that was the point. Maybe this wasn't just her story to carry. Maybe it was meant to remind others of something bigger, of loyalty, of memory, of the sky that belonged to everyone. The woman beside her finally spoke again. "You're very brave, you know." Emma turned, startled. "Brave? I'm scared," the woman smiled gently. "Bravery doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you're still here, still answering, even when you are." Emma let the words sink in. For the first time since the voice had spoken, she felt a small spark of strength. Maybe she wasn't as powerless as she thought. Maybe being Sparrow meant more than being small. Maybe it meant learning to carry the sky inside her, just like her father had. Minutes passed. The passengers slowly settled back, though the tension in the cabin remained. The F-22 stayed close, steady companions in the endless blue. Emma's eyes never left them. She didn't know what the next message would be or why this was happening, but she knew one thing. She was part of it now. Her father's shadow had found her in the sky, and she couldn't run from it. Emma leaned her head against the window, whispering so only she could hear, "Sparrow copies." And as the jet soared beside the plane, she felt the truth of it in her heart. The airplane moved forward with steady grace, but inside the cabin the atmosphere had completely changed. What had started as an ordinary flight now felt like something far greater, almost like a story being written in the sky. The passengers whispered to each other, still glancing toward seat 7A, still trying to understand why fighter jets had called out to a teenager. Emma Parker sat quietly, her body pressed against the window. She could feel the warmth of the sunlight on her face, but inside she felt cold. The call sign, Sparrow, still echoed in her mind. It was her father's voice she heard behind it, even though she knew it was another pilot speaking. Her heart ached. The sky had always reminded her of him, but never like this. Emma slowly reached into her backpack and pulled out the folded photograph she always carried. She opened it carefully, smoothing the worn creases with her fingers. It was her father in uniform, standing tall with his arms around her as a toddler. His smile was broad, full of life, and his eyes looked like they held the entire horizon inside them. She remembered the day the picture was taken. It was before one of his deployments. She had clung to his leg, too young to understand where he was going, only knowing that he was leaving. Her mother had crouched down and said, "Smile for Daddy, Sparrow." And she had. Now, years later, Emma touched the edges of the photo with trembling hands. She whispered softly, "Do you see me, Dad?" They still remember. They called me Sparrow. The woman beside her glanced at the picture, then looked away respectfully, as if sensing that this was not a moment to interrupt. Emma closed her eyes and let her mind drift back to the evenings she had spent sitting on her father's lap, while he told her stories. He used to describe the sky in a way no one else could. "Every bird has a way of flying," he had said once. "Some fly fast, some fly high, some never stop singing. But the sparrow is small and people don't always notice it. Yet the sparrow always finds its way home." She had nodded back then, not really understanding, but now the meaning filled her like a gentle flame. Maybe being Sparrow meant she was stronger than she realized. Maybe it meant she could find her way no matter how lost she felt. Outside, the lead F-22 dipped its wing again, a slow, deliberate motion. Emma leaned closer to the window, her heart pounding. It almost felt like the pilot was speaking without words, offering her recognition and respect. The radio crackled once more. "Sparrow, your father flew with honor. Today we fly for him." Emma's eyes filled with tears. She clutched the photo against her chest. Her father was gone, but his memory lived on in the very skies he had once flown. These pilots were carrying that memory forward, and through her they had found a way to speak it aloud. The passengers gasped softly at the message. They didn't understand the full story, but they understood enough. A little girl had become a symbol of something much bigger than herself. The fear that had first gripped the passengers began to fade. Instead of panic, there was a new kind of silence in the cabin, one filled with wonder. People looked at Emma not with suspicion anymore, but with admiration. A man across the aisle smiled gently and whispered, "Your dad must have been a great man." Emma nodded, unable to speak. Her throat was too tight with emotion. For years she had carried her father's memory like a private treasure, something fragile that only she and her mother shared. Now for the first time the world around her saw it too. It was no longer hidden. The girl who belonged to the sky Emma leaned her forehead against the window, her breath fogging the glass. The F-22s kept their position, strong and steady, like guardians of her journey. She realized that while she felt small inside the airplane, the sky had claimed her as its own. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't forgotten. She was Sparrow. Her father's call sign for her was no longer just a nickname. It was a bridge across time, connecting her to him, to his squadron, and to the sky itself. She whispered softly, "I'll carry it. Dad, I promise." The flight attendant who had spoken to Emma earlier came back, kneeling once more by her seat. He held out a small packet of tissues, his face kind. "For the tears," he said gently. Emma managed a weak smile and took one, dabbing at her eyes. "Thank you." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you want me to tell the captain you're okay?" "He's very concerned," Emma nodded. "Yes, tell him Sparrow is okay." The attendant gave her a respectful nod, as though acknowledging her strength before walking back toward the cockpit. For the first time in her life, Emma felt what it meant to stand in her father's shadow, not as something heavy, but as something proud. As the flight continued, Emma thought of what this moment meant. She thought of her mother, waiting for her at the airport, who had always said she was stronger than she believed. She thought of her father, whose laughter and courage had left echoes she could still hear. She knew that when she landed, she would carry this story with her forever. She would tell her mother what had happened. She would tell her children one day if she had them. She would never let the name Sparrow fade away, because it was more than a name. It was a promise. The airplane cruised steadily on, but Emma no longer felt like a passenger. She felt like part of the sky, part of the vast and endless story unfolding above the earth. The F-22s eventually pulled back slightly, still escorting but giving space. Yet Emma could feel their presence, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. She touched the photograph one last time, then tucked it safely back into her backpack. She whispered, "I'll find my way, just like you said." And as she leaned back in her seat, closing her tired eyes, she felt at peace. For the first time in a long time, the sky didn't feel like it had taken her father away. It felt like it had given him back. The flight continued across the wide stretch of blue, the engines humming softly beneath the wings. Yet inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt almost sacred. The passengers were calmer now, their eyes drifting off into the window where the F-22 still flew in steady formation. Emma Parker sat in seat 7A, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She had cried until her chest ached, but the tears had left behind something strange, something almost like peace. She felt as though her father was closer now than he had been in years, but the silence gave her too much room to think, and thinking brought questions. Why now? She wondered. Why would these pilots remember her father after so long? Why would they call her by his private nickname for her, as if she was part of their world? Emma turned the photograph over in her hand, tracing the faint lines on the back where her mother had once written in ink, "Your dad's favorite Sparrow." Her throat tightened. The passengers kept their distance respectfully, but one older woman leaned across the aisle with a kind smile. "Honey," she whispered, "you must be proud." Emma gave a small nod. "I am. I just don't understand why they remembered." The woman touched her arm lightly. "Some things aren't forgotten. Some people leave marks on the world that last longer than we realize." Emma thought about that, her chest swelling with emotions she couldn't name. A sudden voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We will remain at cruising altitude for a little longer, but rest assured everything is perfectly safe." Then, after a pause, the voice softened. "And to our special passenger in 7A, Sparrow, your father's legacy continues to guide the skies." A hush fell over the cabin again. The captain rarely addressed passengers directly, and now the entire flight felt like it revolved around Emma. A few minutes later, the cockpit door opened. The captain himself stepped into the cabin. He was an older man, his face weathered but warm. He walked slowly down the aisle until he reached seat 7A. Bending down, he said gently, "Miss Parker, I just wanted to meet you in person. Your father and I trained together many years ago. He was one of the best pilots I ever knew." Emma's eyes widened. You knew him?" The captain nodded. "Yes, and when I heard the call sign, I knew exactly who you were." He placed a hand over his heart. "It's an honor to carry his memory in the sky with us today." Emma's lips trembled. She tried to answer, but her words caught in her throat. She simply nodded, clutching the photograph to her chest. The captain gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze, then returned to the cockpit, leaving the cabin in stunned silence. It was as though Emma's quiet grief had spread into the hearts of everyone on board. Passengers who had never spoken to her now looked at her with admiration. Some whispered about her bravery, though she had said so little. One man across the aisle leaned closer. "Your father must have been a hero." Emma's eyes shimmered. "He was, but to me he was just Dad." The man nodded thoughtfully. "The best heroes are often that." For the first time, Emma didn't feel embarrassed about her tears. She felt proud. Remembering her father's words, Emma closed her eyes, resting her head against the seat. In her mind, her father's voice came back to her, steady and strong. "Remember, Sparrow," he had told her once while teaching her how to ride a bike, "you don't have to be the biggest bird in the sky. You just have to keep flying." At the time, she had laughed, thinking he was only joking. But now, high above the world, his words wrapped around her like a blanket. She whispered to herself, "I'll keep flying, Dad." The escort's silent tribute outside. The F-22s shifted slightly. One pilot tilted his wings again, dipping toward her side of the plane. The gesture was clear. They were watching over her. Emma lifted her hand and pressed it against the cold glass of the window. She knew they couldn't see her through the thick layers of metal and glass, but the gesture made her feel connected. Somehow, she believed they knew. A cabin filled with quiet hope. The rest of the passengers settled into an unusual calm. The usual chatter of a flight, laughter, complaints, or the sound of movies playing, was replaced by something gentler. Parents held their children a little closer. Strangers offered each other small smiles. It was as if Emma's story had reminded everyone of something bigger than themselves, of family, of memory, of love. Emma felt it too. She wasn't just Sparrow for herself anymore. In a way, she carried hope for everyone around her. The hours passed slowly, but Emma no longer felt impatient. She knew the flight would eventually land and life would return to ordinary routines. But she promised herself something in that moment. She would not let this memory fade. She would tell her mother about every detail, the call sign, the captain, the jets. She would carry the name Sparrow proudly, not as a reminder of what she had lost, but as a symbol of what she still carried. Her father had given her a gift in that name, and now the sky had given it back to her. As the plane continued its journey, the sky outside began to change. Golden light stretched across the clouds, painting them in shades of pink and orange. It was the kind of sunset her father had always loved, the kind he used to point out when she was little. Emma watched in silence, tears filling her eyes again, but this time, they were softer, gentler tears. In that moment, she felt certain her father was watching too. Somewhere, somehow, he saw her in seat 7A, clutching his photograph, remembering his words, and she felt him whisper back, "Keep flying, Sparrow." The hum of the engines lulled the passengers into a quiet rest. But for Emma, the sky had spoken louder than words. She closed her eyes and leaned into the fading light, her heart steady, her spirit strong. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like a child lost in grief. She felt like Sparrow, the girl her father had believed in all along. The sky outside had softened into twilight. The sun's glow melted into shades of purple and blue, painting the horizon in quiet beauty. Inside the plane, the passengers stirred as the captain's voice came once more over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be preparing for descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and return your trays to the upright position. We thank you for your patience today." The ordinary instructions felt different now. The passengers knew this flight would always remain in their memories, not because of turbulence or delays, but because of the girl in seat 7A. Emma Parker sat quietly, her hands folded around her photograph. Her heart was beating fast. The moment of landing drew closer, and with it came a mix of emotions, nervousness, pride, and something she couldn't quite name. She leaned against the window, watching the F-22s hold their position. Their silver bodies caught the fading light, shining like guardians in the dusk. Just before the descent began, one of the jets tilted its wings again. This time, both planes moved in perfect unison, banking slightly toward the airplane. The movement was graceful, almost like a bow. Emma's breath caught. She knew it was their way of saying goodbye. Her lips parted, and she whispered softly, "Thank you." In her heart, she believed the pilots had carried not just her father's memory, but her own spirit of Sparrow across the sky. The engines shifted, and the airplane began to lower toward the city below. Lights twinkled through the window, scattered like stars on the earth. Passengers adjusted their belts and put away their belongings, the familiar sounds of landing filling the cabin. But Emma barely moved. Her eyes stayed fixed on the escort until at last the jets veered away. They climbed higher into the sky, their shapes fading into the horizon until they disappeared completely. The emptiness left behind was sharp, but not painful. Instead, it felt like closure. Emma pressed the photograph against her chest. "I'll remember," she whispered. "Always." The wheels touched down with a gentle thud, the plane rumbling along the runway before slowing to a calm stop. The cabin filled with the usual round of relieved applause from some passengers. But this time, the clapping carried more than relief. It carried respect, as if every person knew they had shared something remarkable together. The captain's voice returned. "Welcome to our destination, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the crew, we thank you for flying with us." And to Sparrow in seat 7A, this flight was an honor. Emma closed her eyes, letting the words sink deep into her heart. When the airplane doors opened, the passengers filed out slowly, each glancing at Emma with soft smiles or small nods. A few whispered gentle words, "Take care," or "Be proud." She returned their kindness with a shy smile, though her heart was too full to speak. The terminal was bustling with noise and movement, but Emma felt as though she was walking in a quiet bubble. She clutched her backpack close, carrying the photograph like a secret treasure. And then, among the crowd, she saw her mother. Her mother stood near the gate, her eyes wide, scanning the crowd until they landed on Emma. The moment they met, her mother rushed forward, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Emma," her mother whispered, her voice trembling. "I was so worried." Emma clung to her tears finally spilling again. But they were different tears, relieved. "Grateful, full of love, Mom," she whispered. "They called me Sparrow." Her mother froze, pulling back just enough to look into Emma's face. Her eyes filled with emotion. They called you that?" Emma nodded, holding up the photograph. The pilots, the captain, they all remembered Dad. They remembered his call sign for me. Her mother's lips trembled into a smile. She pressed her forehead against Emma's. "Then he was with you, all the way." As they walked together through the terminal, Emma told her mother everything: the F-22s, the captain, the passengers' silence, the sunset. Every detail poured out of her like a story waiting to be told. Her mother listened with tears in her eyes, squeezing Emma's hand tightly. "Your father would be so proud of you," she said softly. "You're carrying his legacy even without realizing it." Emma held her mother's hand and whispered back, "I think I understand now. Sparrow isn't just a name, it's who I am." Later that evening, when they finally reached home, Emma sat by her window looking up at the night sky. The stars sparkled faintly, scattered across the darkness. She thought of her father, of his laughter and the way he had lifted her high into the air when she was little. She thought of his stories about the sky, about sparrows always finding their way home. Emma pressed her hand against the glass, just as she had on the airplane. "I'll keep flying, Dad," she whispered. "I'll keep finding my way." And in that quiet moment, she felt as though the stars themselves were listening. The next day, Emma carefully placed the photograph of her father into a small frame and set it on her desk. She wrote the words, "Keep flying," Sparrow on a slip of paper and tucked it beside the frame. It wasn't just a memory now, it was a promise. She would live her life in a way that honored her father's courage and kindness. She would carry his call sign proudly, not as a reminder of loss, but as a reminder of love that could not be broken. And whenever she looked at the sky, she would remember that she was never alone. Emma was still just a kid, still the girl in seat 7A. But the journey had changed her. She understood now that her father's love, his lessons and his call sign would follow her forever, and even though the world might forget, the sky never would. As she drifted off to sleep that night, her last thought was simple but strong. "I am Sparrow, and I will always keep flying."